Making good stuffing for Thanksgiving can be quite involved, mainly because there's a lot of knife work and a lot of small knife work. So you need to have celery, carrots, and onions all pretty much in a either small dice or brunoise. A brunoise is what I'm doing here with this celery. It's a smaller size dice, 1/8 inch by 1/8 inch. But with the celery, the carrots, and the onions, if you can get them all the same size, they'll all cook evenly. So taking your time to make sure that you have some good knife cuts is really important with stuffing. So what I'm going to do today is cut down my celery, my carrots, and my onions. And I'm doing this a couple of days in advance of when I make my stuffing, because these will hold in the fridge. And any of these larger scraps that I'm cutting, I'm going to use to put on the bottom of my turkey because I don't have a rack to roast it on. So what I'm doing now with the carrot is I'm squaring it off to make it flat on two sides. That way it sits on my cutting board well. Then what I'm doing is making planks and then coming back and cutting the planks into juliennes so that I can turn them and then cut them into their cubes. This is the easiest way to dice something when you're using something that's shaped like a carrot or a celery, is to make these long sticks. Now with an onion, there's a couple of different ways to dice an onion. Some people will take the onion like this and they will do horizontal cuts through the onion, and then they will do vertical cuts through the top to get their size that they're looking for. This is a good way to do it. It's the way a lot of professionals will do it, except if you're not comfortable with your knives, it can be a little daunting. So as you see, I've made those horizontal and vertical cuts, and now I'm coming back to get my dice. So if you're not comfortable with a knife and you really are afraid of doing this, there's another method that you can do to get some good small dice as well with an onion. And that method involves taking your onion, cutting it in half, cutting it into quarters, and then taking those quarters and peeling off the petals so that you have 2 or 3 petals in one shot, squaring off the end, and then going through and doing that vertical cut through the onion to make the small dice. This way is a little bit more accurate. It does take a lot more time, but again, if you're not comfortable with your knives or using a knife, this is the better way to go. So once we have all of our vegetables cut, we're going to need to go back and we're going to need to cut our bread. Now with stuffing, the bread does not have to be fresh, and actually the more stale the bread, the better the stuffing can come out because it actually holds its texture. If you have really fresh bread, when you add your liquid in, it gets really mushy, and sometimes it gets a little bit like glossy looking because of the amount of liquid used. So what I'm doing here is just using a bread knife. If you don't have a bread knife, use a regular knife, as long as it's sharp enough, or even if it mashes it up, it doesn't matter. Same idea. We're going to cut it into sticks and then cut it into cubes. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let this bread sit out on my counter for 2 days while the vegetables sit in the fridge for when I'm actually ready to make the stuffing. On the day that I'm going to make the stuffing, I'm going to mince some garlic as well so that the garlic is fresh. I don't like to do this ahead of time. The garlic just does not have the same flavor when you dice it ahead of time. So same thing as the onion. I'm going to make my horizontal and vertical cuts, and then that way I can get my nice mince of garlic. Now to make the stuffing, we're going to need to get our pan onto the stove, and we're going to get it onto a medium-low heat, not too high so we burn our butter. So we're going to add our butter right into the pan, and as the butter starts to melt, we're going to add our garlic to it. And if we stir this around very lightly, we'll see that the butter and the garlic are starting to get hot by the way that the butter starts to bubble. So once that starts to bubble, we're going to add our onions, carrots, and celery, and we're going to cook them until they're translucent. And while those are cooking, we're going to chop up our sage. And what I've done here is I've taken sage and I've dried it from last year. It was hanging, and I'm just chopping it up. Fresh sage or dried sage works really well, as long as you're not using dried sage from a canister that's probably 4 years old. After we get all that added into the pot, we're going to make our base and water blend. If you have chicken stock, use that instead. It tends to be better than base. But if you don't, you can use about a tablespoon of base to 2 cups of water or so. Dissolve that with the hot water, and you'll start to pour that into the stuffing and start to stir it. And as you can see on the bottom, it's starting to absorb that liquid. What I like to do is I like to add 2/3 of the liquid to 2/3 of the bread to see where I'm at. And then I start adding the bread, the remaining bread, to the stuffing to see if I can adjust the texture. And if I need more liquid, I just add more liquid. Of course, as always, make sure you season it with salt and pepper. And once you basically have it all mixed together to the consistency that you like, you cook it for about 5 more minutes and it's done.